At exactly noon on a blood-soaked October day in AD 52, 19,000, doomed men lowered their weapons and waited for Emperor Claudius to keep his promise of mercy. Water churned red against burning ship walls. Tired fighters, criminals, and war captives who'd survived hours of sea battle stood knee-deep in the man-made lake. Above them, the emperor's purple-draped balcony cast its shadow. They had done everything perfectly. Morturi te salutant, those who are about to die salute you. The ritual words had echoed across the flooded arena just hours before. Metal blades splashed into the crimson water. Shields dropped with a crash. The men had given Rome its show. Now they waited for their reward of freedom. Imperial horns suddenly roared across the arena, not the sound of mercy, but the command to fight again. Fear spread through 19,000 throats as Praetorian archers pulled arrows along the arena's edge. The emperor's promise had been an act, just another scene in the performance. Guards began firing into the mass of men who had moments ago believed they'd won their lives. There was no shore to swim to, no exits without spears, only the grim value of entertainment in their final moments of betrayal. But how had the world's most advanced civilization turned ritual honor fights into mass death as entertainment? Why did millions of Romans, even wise men and priests, believe that staging suffering was needed for social order? To understand how we arrived at this floating slaughterhouse, we must go back 3 centuries, to a simple funeral where 3 pairs of slaves fought to honor a dead nobleman, unknowingly planting the seed of an empire-wide horror. Bronze scraped stone as the first gladiator in Roman history fell at a funeral. It was 264 BC, and Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva had just created a tradition that would outlast his own empire. His father lay on the funeral pyre, wrapped in fine cloth, surrounded by grieving family. But Decimus had prepared something unusual, what he called his munus, his duty to the dead. 6 slaves stood in the cleared ground before the pyre, friends, most likely men who had worked the same fields, eaten from the same pot, and slept in the same court. Now they held strange weapons, their farm hands shaking as they gripped military hilts. "Fight," Decimus ordered. "Honor my father with your blood." The mourners shifted uneasily. Human sacrifice was not Roman. That was what barbarians did. But this, Decimus insisted, was different. This was not sacrifice. This was sport with meaning. The first pair circled each other. You could hear their breathing over the funeral songs. They were no trained warriors, only farmhands given sword. One slave, let's call him Marcus, kept glancing at the funeral pyre, then at his opponent, then at the armed guards watching them. The choice was simple: fight your friend or die anyway. But this wasn't called murder. It was munus, a sacred duty. Marcus swung first, wild and desperate. His opponent, maybe the same man he harvested crops with last season, tried to dodge but was too slow. Bronze cut into flesh. The crowd gasped, not in horror but in something new. Blood spattered onto the sacred ground as the first man fell. The second pair was already being pushed forward. The mourners leaned in. The weeping had stopped. Even the widow was watching now. By the time all 3 fights ended, 3 men lay dead and 3 stood panting, covered in their friend's blood. Decimus nodded approvingly. His father's spirit had been well served. The survivors were led away to freedom, Decimus announced. The crowd murmured, approval. Justice and mercy balanced perfectly. Beautiful, someone whispered. The Etruscans do something similar. But this has Roman dignity. What started with 6 men would eventually claim millions. The funeral guests departed with strange energy. They'd come to mourn but left discussing the fights. Who showed courage? Who fought with skill despite no training? When was the next funeral? Within months, other noble families began including paired fighters at their ceremonies. Just 1 pair at first, then 2, then 3. The excuse was always religious, honoring the dead, but everyone knew better. They came for the blood, One elderly senator wrote to his son, "Yesterday I attended Quintus' funeral. The gladiator contests were unsettling, yet I find myself thinking about them constantly. There was something pure in those desperate struggles. Something true." The words spread through Rome's elite like wine staining cloth. Munus took on new meaning. No longer just duty to the dead. Now it meant the gift of violence wrapped in piety. Within decades, private grief would become public addiction, and the word munus would take on a meaning that would horrify even its creator. The senator's voice echoed through marble halls. Double the gladiators, or lose the election. It was 2016 BC, barely 50 years after that first funeral fight. Marcus Aelius Lepidus stood before the Senate, sweat beading under his toga. He wasn't discussing war or trade or law. He was negotiating death as campaign strategy. 20 pairs, Lepidus insisted. My opponent promises 15. The people expect more. The transformation had been swift. What began as private funeral rites had mutated into political currency. Every ambitious Roman now understood. Votes could be bought with blood, but one ambitious Iliadil was about to change everything. Gaius Scribonius Curio had a problem. The year was 53 BC, and he needed to become consul. His wealth, moderate, his military glory, none. His solution would reshape Rome forever. I'll build something new, Curio told his advisors. 2 wooden theaters back to back. During the day, separate stages for plays. But watch this, he gestured excitedly with his hands. They rotate. The theaters spin on pivots and join into one great oval. An amphitheater for gladiators. His architect paled. The engineering alone will bankrupt me. I know, but imagine 5,000 Romans watching 50 pairs of gladiators. Not at some funeral just because. The Senate erupted when Curio announced his games. Madness, old Cato shouted. Fighting without religious purpose. It's sacrilege. Senator Publius stood slowly. Collegiates. The people love these contests. Why shouldn't the state provide what they desire? Consider it public welfare. The vote was unanimous. Democracy had just voted for mass murder. Within a decade, every political career required blood offerings. Evadila's praetors, consuls, each office came with an expected death toll. Julius Caesar, still young and ambitious, borrowed ruinous sums to provide 320 pairs of gladiators. His rivals whispered about bankruptcy. The crowd whispered about generosity. Did you hear? Citizens asked in the forums. Caesar's gladiators will have silver armor, pure silver. The mathematics of advancement became grotesque. One historian calculated that reaching the consulship now required causing approximately 100 deaths. The Senate didn't discuss this openly. They discussed logistics, where to house gladiators, how to source prisoners, weapon quality standards. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator and philosopher, wrote to a friend, I attended yesterday's games given by young Pompey. 3 hours, 60 deaths. The crowd was transported. I fear what we're becoming. His friend wrote back, but you attended, didn't you? The state had discovered something darker than bread and circuses. They had found that shared bloodshed created shared identity. When 50,000 Romans screamed together as a gladiator fell, they became one organism, one will, easy to direct, easy to control. Soon career advancement would be measured not in speeches or laws, but in body counts. The lion hadn't eaten in 8 days exactly as the beastmasters planned. Deep beneath Rome's arenas, a new profession had emerged. Bestiary, not the fighters but the keepers. Men who understood that natural predators weren't cruel enough for Roman entertainment. They needed enhancement. Titus Flavius worked the cages for 20 years. He kept detailed notes. Lions require 7 days minimum starvation for reliable aggression. Bears only 4. They're naturally angrier. Leopards are unpredictable. Sometimes they play with prey too long. The crowd grows bored. The science was precise. Too hungry and animals became lethargic. Not hungry enough and they might ignore the condemned entirely. One disaster in 62 AD saw a well-fed lion lie down next to a Christian prisoner and sleep. The crowd rioted. The beastmaster was fed to his own animals the next day. But the prisoners had learned something the guards didn't expect. Word traveled through Rome's dungeons faster than plague. Prisoners scheduled for damnatio ad bestias began their own countermeasures. Some starved themselves to weakness, hoping animals would find them uninteresting. Others did exercises, believing fit prey might fight back successfully. Marcus the thief had survived 3 years in the dungeons. He taught newcomers. They spray you with blood first. Animal blood usually makes you smell like food. But if you roll in your own waste first, does it work? A young prisoner asked. Marcus showed his scars. I'm still here, the beastmasters adapted. They began mixing aromatic oils with the blood spray. They tested different combinations on slaves. They kept charts of which scents triggered which animals. Science serving sadism. One keeper's journal survived. Tried lamb's blood mixed with honey on subject. The bear's reaction was immediate and thorough. Recommend for future use. That's when they discovered the suicide in cell block 3. The guard found him at dawn, a Dacian warrior who'd fashioned a noose from his own tunic. But this wasn't unusual. What disturbed the authorities was the note scratched into the wall with a stone. I die, Roman free. Suicide became epidemic among those sentenced to the beasts. The administration viewed this as theft, stealing the crowd's entertainment. New protocols emerged. Round-the-clock watches, forced feeding, hands bound except during supervised meals. The irony wasn't lost on observers. Rome worked harder to keep condemned men alive than it did to feed regular citizens. A guard named Quintus wrote to his wife, "Today I saved a man from hanging himself. Tomorrow I'll watch him fed to bears. I don't sleep well anymore." But the most disturbing innovation came from a suggestion box. Yes, they had them. A citizen proposed, why not use criminals' families as motivation? Tell a man his children will be spared if he provides good entertainment. The proposal was adopted within a week. One philosopher watching would write words that revealed just how deep the rot had spread. 10,000 slaves spent 6 months digging what they thought was a reservoir. They were digging their own arena. Julius Caesar stood at the edge of the massive basin, his purple cloak whipping in the wind. The hole stretched wider than the forum, deeper than a 3-story building. Engineers buzzed around him with measurements and calculations. This would be his masterpiece, not of war but of entertainment. How many ships? Caesar asked. 40 imprider, 20 per side, and men, 4,000 prisoners, 2,000 per fleet. Caesar smiled. The Roman people had seen gladiators. They had seen beast hunts, but they'd never seen this actual naval warfare in the heart of Rome. History itself as lethal theater. The prisoners knew nothing. They hauled dirt day after day, told only that Caesar was improving Rome's water supply. Some joked about it. Finally, something useful from these hands, old Bren laughed. His Gallic accent thick. He'd been captured at Alesia, watched Vercingetorix surrender. Now he dug. But Caesar had a specific historical battle in mind. They'll recreate Salamis, Caesar told his advisor. Greeks versus Persians. The crowd knows the story. Now they'll see it. Which prisoners play which side? Someone asked. Does it matter? They're all enemies of Rome. The preparation was meticulous. Historians were consulted to ensure accuracy. Greek-style triremes were built, just smaller. Persian vessels too, with their distinctive decorations. Costumes were prepared. The condemned would die in character. 6 months of digging. Then came the aqueduct connection. The prisoners watched water rush into their excavation, still not understanding. Some cheered, thinking their work complete. Surely freedom followed. When the water finally flooded in, the prisoners understood. Brenner stood chained with hundreds of others. As guards explained their fate, they would board ships. They would fight. The last crew floating would live. Caesar's promise. "But I'm no sailor," someone protested. A guard laughed. "You'll learn quickly or die quickly." The absurdity hit them in waves. Gauls playing Greeks, Germans playing Persians, all performing a battle from centuries past for Roman entertainment. History as death sentence. Training was brief and brutal. How to row in unison, how to ram another vessel, how to board and fight on a rocking deck. Several drowned during practice. The trainers shrugged acceptable losses. Caesar attended every planning session. He insisted on details. The Persian ships should attack first. Historically accurate. The Greeks will feign retreat, then turn just like Salamis. Except every actor would actually die. This was just practice. The next emperor would make Caesar's lake look like a puddle. The day arrived. 40,000 Romans surrounded the artificial lake. Caesar's box dominated the eastern shore, purple and gold blazing in sunlight. The water was pristine blue. It wouldn't stay that way. Horns announced the start. 2 fleets rode out, banners flying. Greeks on the north, Persians on the south. 4,000 men who'd never asked to be actors in Caesar's historical drama. The crowd exploded as the first ram struck home. Wood splintered. Men screamed. Bodies hit water. This wasn't imitation. This was real naval combat with real casualties. The precision of Salamis dissolved into chaotic survival. Brennus, dressed as a Greek hoplite, drove his spear through a Persian who'd been his cellmate. The man's eyes, shocked, betrayed, would haunt him for the few hours he had left to live. By sunset, only 3 ships remained floating. 200 men out of 4,000. Caesar, magnanimous in victory, granted them all pardons. The crowd roared approval. Such mercy, such justice. As slaves drained the lake that night, pulling hundreds of corpses from pink water, Caesar was already planning. Next time, he told his secretary, "We need a permanent venue." This was just the beginning. The aqueduct ran for miles, not to bring life to Rome, but death to thousands. Augustus Caesar inherited his uncle's vision and engineered it into permanence. Where Julius improvised a basin, Augustus built infrastructure. His naumachia wasn't just bigger, it was a permanent scar on Earth itself. The numbers alone defied comprehension. 1,800 feet long, 1,200 feet wide, an artificial lake that could hold 30 full-sized warships. But the true innovation was invisible. An entire aqueduct, the Aqua Alsiatina, built solely to flood this arena of death. Lead engineer Vitruvius documented everything. His plans survived, showing mathematical precision applied to mass murder. Water flow rates calculated to fill the basin in exactly 6 hours. Drainage systems designed to remove bodies efficiently. Viewing platforms engineered to prevent crowd crushes when 200,000 Romans attended. Engineers even calculated water pressure needed to drown men efficiently. The technical challenges fascinated Rome's finest minds. How deep should water be for authentic naval combat? But shallow enough to retrieve corpses. Vitruvius settled on 12 feet deep enough to drown. Shallow enough for cleanup crews. But physics created unexpected problems. Ships needed ballast for stability. Normal stones were used, but condemned men kept diving down, grabbing rocks to weight themselves for suicide. The solution: sealed ballast compartments. Even self-destruction was engineered away. The aqueduct's route troubled some engineers. It crossed 3 sacred groves, 2 cemeteries, and multiple private farms. Augustus waved concerns aside. The people need their games, he declared. Property was seized. Graves were relocated. Sacred trees. One farmer, displaced from ancestral land, cursed the construction. May every gallon carry blood instead of water. Workers laughed nervously. Within a year, his words proved prophetic. But maintaining water quality became unexpectedly complex. The first full-scale naumachia, under Augustus recreated the Battle of Actium, his own victory over Antony and Cleopatra. 30 ships per side, 6,000 condemned men, the bitter irony. Many prisoners were veterans of the actual battle, now forced to reenact their defeat. But after 3 hours of combat, a new problem emerged. Blood and bodies fouled the water so badly that ships could barely move. The carefully choreographed battle devolved into a sluggish massacre. Oars caught on floating corpses. The stench overwhelmed spectators in the lower seats. Augustus's engineers worked through the night. By morning they'd installed a revolutionary system, underground pipes that could pump fresh water in, while draining the contaminated. The infrastructure of death had achieved new sophistication. A preserved maintenance manual detailed procedures. Begin freshwater flow after first hour of combat. Increase flow rate, proportional to casualty estimates. Full drainage and refill between morning and afternoon shows. The infrastructure was complete. Now they needed mythology to justify using it. The musician played his lyre beautifully. The bear didn't care. It was the Colosseum's grand opening in AD 80, and Emperor Titus had promised spectacles beyond imagination. The crowd of 50,000 had already witnessed hours of beast hunts and gladiator battles. But now came something new. Mythology brought to lethal life. The condemned man, a Greek prisoner named Alexios, had been chosen for his musical ability. The irony wasn't lost on him. In his homeland, he'd performed Orpheus's songs at weddings. Now he'd die as Orpheus for Roman entertainment. They dressed him perfectly, a flowing white robe, a golden lyre, a laurel crown. From the emperor's box you might actually believe Orpheus himself had materialized in the arena. The crowd hushed as Alexios began to play. His fingers found familiar melodies, songs of love transcending death, of music taming wild nature. Children in the crowd knew the myth. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Young Marcus tugged his father's toga. But father, Orpheus charms all animals with his music. That's the story. His father shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes stories need updating. The bear emerged from a hidden door. 400 pounds of engineered hunger. The crowd held its breath. In the myth, Orpheus's music would soothe the beast. It would lie at his feet, pacified by divine melody. Alexios played louder, fingers flying across strings. The song was perfect. A desperate, beautiful plea to whatever gods might listen. The bear paused, perhaps confused by the noise. For one moment, myth and reality aligned. Then training overtook instinct. The bear had been taught, man plus arena equals food. It charged. Alexios kept playing until the last second. Witnesses swore the music continued even as claws struck flesh. Though that was likely imagination. What wasn't imagined was the sound. Strings snapping, mixed with screams that harmonized horribly with the lyre's final notes. But Martial was taking notes, and his irony cut deeper than any sword. The court poet watched from the patrician seats, stylus moving across wax tablet. By evening, his epigrams circulated through Rome's elite. Orpheus charmed all nature in the stories of old, but in Caesar's arena the bear was unmoved by song. Perhaps our beasts are different than myth told, or perhaps our Orpheus simply wasn't good enough. The bitter humor masked darker truth. Rome hadn't just killed a man, they'd murdered meaning itself. Every child who'd loved the Orpheus tale now had a new ending burned into memory. The sacred stories that taught civilization's values had become scripts for execution. If they could pervert Orpheus, no story was safe, especially not religious ones. The pitch-soaked fabric clung to skin in moments. The victim would become a human torch. Nero had elevated execution to art form. The tunica molesta, the troublesome shirt, was his masterpiece of cruelty. Part punishment, part performance, pure horror disguised as justice. The process was methodical. Condemned prisoners were stripped, their bodies coated with wax. Then came the shirt itself, woven from coarse fabric and soaked in pitch, sulfur, and resin. The mixture was precisely calculated, burn hot enough to ensure death, slow enough to ensure spectacle. In Nero's gardens, special poles had been erected at artistic intervals. Landscape architects, yes, they employed those, ensured proper spacing for optimal viewing. Too close, and the heat drove spectators back. Too far, and you lost the visceral impact. Guards had learned to plug their noses during preparation. Marcus Flavius served on the execution squad for 3 years before requesting transfer. In his memoir, discovered centuries later, he wrote, "The worst wasn't the burning. It was before painting pitch on living flesh." While they pleaded, many guards drank heavily. I chose reassignment. The condemned knew what awaited in the holding cell. Some tried to suffocate themselves with their regular tunics. Guards removed all fabric, keeping prisoners naked until the final moment. Even modesty became a tool of control. One innovation particularly pleased Nero, timing the ignitions for sunset. As natural light faded, human torches illuminated his garden parties. Guests strolled between burning bodies, discussing politics and poetry, while men screamed above them. But one victim's final words would haunt even the executioner. Her name was Claudia, a Christian seamstress, accused of insulting Roman gods. As guards prepared her tunica molesta, she spoke clearly, "You dress me in flame, but clothe yourselves in shame. My pain ends tonight. Your guilt burns forever." The guard applying pitch, a young man named Gaius, stopped mid-stroke. His commander barked orders. Gaius resumed, but his hands shook. That night, as Claudia burned at Nero's party, Gaius watched from his post. She never screamed, not once. Within a week, Gaius had disappeared. Some said desertion. Others whispered conversion. His replacement found a note in the barracks. "I've painted my last innocent with pitch. Let Rome find other hands for its horrors." Tertullian watched Christians burn and wrote something that would outlive the empire. The Christian philosopher stood among the crowd, forced to witness his brethren's execution. But instead of despair, Tertullian felt something else: clarity. He wrote that night, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. Every torch Nero lights illuminates not our destruction, but his own darkness. Rome believes it's extinguishing a threat. It's actually spreading a fire. It cannot control the fire of truth against tyranny." His words proved prophetic. Each burning created witnesses. Some were horrified into compliance, but others asked questions. Why did these Christians die so peacefully? What faith could overcome such agony? The spectacle meant to terrorize became testimony. Nero had transformed execution into evangelism, though he'd never understand it. The burning shirts that should have ended a movement instead ensured its survival. The empire's greatest moral teacher left the arena feeling more cruel and inhuman. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, Stoic philosopher, advisor to emperors, conscience of Rome, had attended the games, not the elaborate spectacles with their veneer of honor, but the noon executions, the intermission entertainment, pure slaughter without pretense. He wrote to his friend Lucilius that evening, hand trembling slightly as stylus met wax. "I happened to drop in at midday expecting sport and wit, and some relaxation. It was just the reverse. The morning's combat was merciful compared to this. Now there is nothing but butchery." The noon slot was reserved for the Noxiae criminals with no training, no weapons worth mentioning, no hope. They were herded into the arena in groups, given rusty blades and ordered to kill each other. The survivor of each pair faced the next condemned man. It continued until none remained. The spectators demand that those who have just committed murder should be thrown to those who will commit it. The victor is detained for another slaughter. The only exit is death. He kept attending, even as he documented his own corruption. This was Seneca's private shame. Intellectual understanding couldn't break physical compulsion. He knew the games were wrong. He wrote brilliantly against them. Yet when the horns sounded, his feet carried him to the amphitheater. "I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more voluptuous, even more cruel and inhuman, he confessed. The honesty was searing. Rome's greatest mind admitting that proximity to sanctioned murder had infected him with its disease. But Seneca observed something worse than his own weakness. He watched the crowd. Not the bloodthirsty plebs of stereotype, but ordinary Romans, mothers with children, merchants, priests, teachers, all leaning forward as the killing began. You can see the guilt on their faces afterward, he noted. Yet they returned. We all returned. His students would read these words while buying their own tickets. The hypocrisy spread through Rome's educated classes like philosophy itself. They read Seneca's condemnations in morning study, then attended afternoon games. They nodded at his wisdom, then cheered at death. One student, Lucan, wrote to his teacher, "Master, I've memorized your letter about the game's corrupting influence. I quoted it at dinner last night." Everyone agreed. Then we all went to watch the Gladiators. What is wrong with us? Seneca's reply survives. What's wrong is that we've made vice into virtue, brutality into bravery, murder into morality. We've inverted every value we claim to hold, and we've done it so completely that even seeing it clearly changes nothing. But Seneca's warnings were drowned out by a mob discovering its true appetite. They sang hymns as the flames reached their feet. It only made the crowd angrier. The systematic persecution of Christians had transformed from political necessity into public entertainment. What began as suppression of a dangerous cult evolved into elaborate theatrical productions, where faith itself became combustible material. In AD 64, after Rome's Great Fire, Nero needed scapegoats. Christians were perfect, mysterious enough to fear, peaceful enough to capture easily, numerous enough to provide sustained entertainment. But something unexpected happened when they began executing them en masse. The Christians wouldn't follow the script. Traditional condemned prisoners begged, cursed, fought. They provided the emotional journey audiences expected. Defiance to desperation to death. Christians broke the narrative. They prayed for their executioners. They sang, they smiled. One arena announcer, frustrated, reportedly shouted, "These Christians refuse to entertain properly. They die like they're going somewhere better." The more peacefully they died, the more creative the executions became. If burning wouldn't break their spirit, perhaps beasts would. If beasts failed, try crucifixion, drowning, flaying. Rome's execution engineers worked overtime, designing new methods to extract proper terror from improper victims. But each escalation backfired. A young woman named Perpetua, her diary preserved by fellow Christians, wrote the night before her execution, "Tomorrow I fight beasts in the arena. But I've already won. They can kill this body. It's temporary anyway. My true life begins at death." She entered the arena carrying her infant daughter, handed the child to a watching Christian, then faced the leopards with arms spread wide. The crowd, expecting maternal hysteria, got maternal transcendence. Many left disturbed. One young mother's final act would convert her executioner. Blandina, a slave girl from Gaul, endured tortures that made hardened soldiers vomit, burned with hot irons, mauled by beasts, hung on a stake. Throughout it all, she repeated, "I am a Christian. We do nothing wrong." The executioner assigned to finish her, a veteran named Taurus who'd killed hundreds, approached with his sword. Blandina looked up, blood streaming from countless wounds, and said, "You look tired, friend. This burden must be heavy. Know that I forgive you, and my God loves you." Taurus's sword shook. He'd been called many things by the condemned monster demon, bastard, but never friend, never forgiven. The stroke that should have been clean went wide. It took 3 attempts. That night, Taurus disappeared into Rome's Christian underground. His conversion note was simple. "She called me friend while I killed her." What God teaches such love? All of this was building to one emperor's ultimate spectacle, one that would finally go too far. Below the sand, 200 men worked pulleys and pipes. They never saw the deaths they enabled. The Colosseum's hypogeum was Rome's greatest engineering marvel, not for what it built, but for what it hid. Beneath the killing floor stretched a labyrinth of chambers, corridors, and mechanisms, an underground city dedicated to delivering death efficiently. Slaves worked in perpetual twilight, operating the elevators that lifted beasts into sunlight. They manned the pulleys that raised scenery. They controlled the pipes that could flood the arena for naval battles. They were the unseen stagehands of slaughter. Marcus Quintus supervised Section 7 for 5 years. His logbook survived Tuesday. Elevator 3 jammed with lion halfway up. Beast agitated. Lost 2 men extracting it. Wednesday, blood seepage from above contaminating gear mechanisms. Requested sand replacement. Denied, too expensive. The workers developed their own culture. They never spoke of what happened above, referring only to the performance. They knew, of course, everyone knew. But distance allowed dissociation. One engineer realized his flooding system had trapped men below. It happened during a test flood for an upcoming Namassia. Gaius Maximus, chief hydraulic engineer, activated his masterpiece, pipes that could fill the arena in 2 hours. Water rushed through channels, valves opened in sequence. The arena began its transformation into a lake. Then screaming echoed from Section 12. 20 slaves maintaining the beast cages had no warning. Water burst through drainage grates, filling the narrow corridor. The exit doors, designed to seal during floods, had activated automatically. Gaius heard their pounding fists against bronze doors, their cries growing more desperate as water rose. "Release the seals," he shouted. "Can't," his assistant replied. "Would drain the arena. The Emperor is reviewing tomorrow." Gaius ran to the manual overrides. His supervisor stopped him. 20 slaves or disgrace before Caesar. Which would you choose? The pounding stopped after 10 minutes. The test was deemed successful. That night, Gaius modified the system. Emergency latches accessible from inside. His supervisor had them removed. "Compromises water integrity," he noted. The Emperor's special request arrived, flooding during the fight. The order came directly from Claudius for his grand Namassia. Not before the battle, as usual, but during it. Let the condemned fight while water rose around them. Transform naval combat into a race against drowning. The engineering team exchanged glances. Technically possible, but unprecedented. The flooding system was designed for empty arenas, not ones packed with 19,000 men. "What about those who can't swim?" an engineer asked. The imperial messenger shrugged. "That's rather the point. Everything was ready for Claudius's Namassia. 19,000 men were about to discover that even perfect obedience couldn't save them." The imperial horns echoed across the water as 19,000 condemned men realized their promised pardons were theater. Claudius rose in his box, purple toga catching the afternoon sun. His speech carried across the artificial sea. "You have entertained Rome well, but the show requires a finale worthy of your opening. Resume combat. Die gloriously. This is my mercy, a death with meaning rather than mere execution." The betrayal rippled through the floating armies like the waves their struggles created. These weren't fresh fighters. They were exhausted men who had already given Rome hours of naval warfare. Men who believed survival was possible if they just followed the rules, performed their roles, died correctly. A Dacian prisoner named Decebalus threw down his sword. "We already fought, we saluted. We did everything required." Praetorian archers answered with arrows, not aimed to kill but to wound, to force resumed combat. The message was clear: fight each other or be slowly picked apart from shore. What followed wasn't battle but mechanized murder. Exhausted men swung swords with dead arms. Ships rammed without strategy, just desperate attempts to end the inevitable faster. The water, already pink, turned crimson. Some tried swimming to shore. Auxiliary troops with spears waited at the water's edge, pushing them back. Others dove deep, choosing drowning over continued performance. Guards in small boats used poles to force them back to the surface. A Greek prisoner found energy for one last act of defiance. He climbed his ship's mast and shouted, "Romans, you watch us die for sport, but we are men. We had families, we had names. I am Theron of Athens, and I die naming you all murderers." An arrow struck him mid-sentence. He fell into water already thick with bodies. The crowd cheered. Finally, some passion in the performance. By sunset, not one of the 19 Claudius had kept his promise in the cruelest way. They'd received mercy from further existence in Rome's world. The emperor declared the games magnificent. Historians recorded it as a triumph of Roman entertainment. But something had shifted. Even the mob seemed subdued, leaving the arena. They'd seen spectacular deaths before, but never betrayal on this scale. Never such mechanized erasure of hope. Parents carried sleeping children past drainage pipes, running red, past slaves fishing corpses from poisoned water. Senator Cassius wrote that night, "I've attended games for 40. Today was different. We didn't watch men die. We watched Rome's soul drown with them." The appetite grows with feeding. But what happens when nothing satisfies anymore? His question would be answered within decades. The games continued, each emperor striving to surpass previous spectacles, until bread and circuses couldn't distract from empty treasuries, invading armies, internal collapse. Rome fell, but not before teaching history a permanent lesson about the endpoint of entertainment without conscience. Today we shake our heads at Roman brutality while binge-watching violence, turning tragedy into content, consuming human suffering through screens instead of arenas. The medium evolved. The appetite didn't. Seneca's words echo across centuries. Each spectacle of suffering we consume for entertainment makes us more cruel and inhuman. We just don't notice because our Colosseum is digital, our complicity distributed through views and clicks rather than cheer. The 19,000 who died in Claudius's Naumachia believed civilization meant something, that rules mattered, that obedience earned mercy. They discovered too late that when entertainment becomes more valuable than humanity, even perfect compliance can't save you from becoming content. Their bodies were burned in mass pits outside Rome. No names recorded, no graves marked, just statistics in an emperor's achievement log. 19,000 humans reduced to a single line. Claudius provided exceptional game, but their unnamed voices carry a warning we still refuse to hear. The transformation from citizen to spectator, from empathy to appetite, from human to consumer, happens one entertaining atrocity at a time, until one day you're standing in your own arena, realizing too late that you're not in the audience, you're in the